Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I read in the papers yesterday, you probably did too, that the FTSE bosses' pay, the bosses of the FTSE 100 companies enjoyed an average 12% rise in their take-home pay last year, while the rest of us, their employees, barely received any pay increases at all, and indeed many people are on short time or actually taking pay cuts. It's particularly piquant that the chief executive of Thames Water, who has the beautifully appropriate name of Mr. Baggs, has doubled his pay during a year in which complaints with Thames Water from their customers increased, leaks increased, and profits declined. CEOs, like many other people running mega organizations, have developed delusions of omnipotence. My aim is to demonstrate that we can overcome the problems of oligarchy if we have the energy to make the structures of power more explicit and render the holders of power properly accountable and their operations fully transparent. What won't do anymore is the quiet word in the chairman's ear or that dreaded word consultation, i.e. Getting people to agree to what you've already decided to do. Localism, which is another of my themes, it's not just a sentimental retro gesture. It's by rebuilding the strength and independence of those intermediate institutions, what Burke called the little platoons, that you fill the space between the state and the citizen, and you spread power and make democracy more of a reality. Now, the coalition has a splendid localist agenda. One of the interesting things is that the coalition program is much more localist, much more radical than either of the two parties singly. So something strange did happen in those 6 days in May 2 years ago when they got together, and they produced this really interesting program, which was quite different from the programs that either of the big parties had produced before. And some of it has been made into law. There is, for example, something called the General Power of Competence under the Localism Act, which means that now a council can do anything that it isn't specifically prohibited from doing, as long as it's legal, whereas before the general rule was that the council could only do those things that it was specifically empowered to do. So that sounds fine, but of course it's only a mere bauble as long as local councils and communities and parishes don't have proper revenue-raising powers of the sort that they have in most other countries and of the sort that they really had in Britain up till the 1980s, and rates started being capped and the business rate started being collared by Whitehall. What the evidence is from all over the world, not just from Britain, is that local councils are really just as careful and prudent as Whitehall in the way they spend our money. In fact, if you look at some of the examples of the way Whitehall has spent our money in the last 10, 20 years, they could scarcely fail to be more prudent. Think of the National Health Service, billions wasted on a new IT system which didn't work. But of course, it's always tempting for ministers, let alone for the European Commission, to cling on to the right to interfere in order to respond to media clamour and to appear to be on top of the situation. They get sucked in so easily. I mean, there was a brilliant example with the rubbish. First of all, they said, you must recycle more and landfill less. So then the councils respond by making rubbish collections fortnightly. Ministers then demand a return to weekly collections. Council say it's too expensive. Treasury gives them some money. Then the council said they'd rather spend the money on genuine recycling rather than having weekly collections back. So quite without meaning to, the government and the EU between them have now been dragged into huge national recycling programs at vast expense for something which you could perfectly well have financed locally if local councils had had the power. In parallel to this, local political organizations were also being dismantled or perhaps hollowed out. And those local parties which might have protested against the erosion of local power were being gradually removed from any serious role in the direction of their parties. As you've seen in the Labour Party, as in the Conservative Party, the freedom of constituency parties to choose who they wanted as their candidate was rigorously limited. Influence on party policy was extinguished, and party conferences became a complete joke. And not surprisingly, party membership went into headlong decline. In the post-war years, it's extraordinary to think back that about 1 in 5 of us belonged to one of the big political parties. Now the figure is roughly 1 in 100. And belonging to a political party has become a bit weird, something you don't sort of own up to very readily. And of course the trouble is the party leaders don't give a toss, because the smaller their party base, the less they need to listen to it. If their members can be dismissed as elderly, out of touch, and rabid at the edges, so much the better. Yet you could argue perfectly well, there's a perfectly good case for saying that it's the party activists who have a better sense of what's gone wrong than the central elites. The concerns of the Tory right about the incursions and ambitions of the European Union, and the European Commission in particular, are now recognized across a much wider spectrum as perfectly rational and not the outcome of rabid xenophobia. Ditto their concerns about the precipitous surge in immigration during the Blair-Brown years. On the left, the long-held concern of the left about the galloping inequality and the stagnation of living standards at the bottom went unheard of during the years of Labour's infatuation with the filthy rich. Everyone is beginning to listen now. So I think there's a curious parallel between the castration of local government and the castration of local parties. Both trends are presented to us as part of modernity, both inevitable and irreversible. That's being up to date. Politicians, if you ask politicians, they will say, people have better things to do with their time now than to sit in boring meetings in drafty halls. But of course this is nonsense, because people actually spend more time, certainly as much time as they ever did in public meetings to save the local hospital, or to fend off a waste disposal plant, or to raise cash for churches or bird sanctuaries, meetings even to listen to people like me selling their books. What people won't do is to turn up for meetings which have been drained of power and purpose. I think we reached the nadir there a few years ago when it's emerged that both big parties were almost totally reliant on a few millionaire donors. And of course the irony was that the millionaire donors were just as likely to be dodgy, demanding, or demented as the rank and file who'd been displaced. What I look forward to is the impending bankruptcy of all three parties as the best hope of regenerating them, because only bankruptcy can force them to set about reviving local political life in this country. One or two reviewers complained that this book offers rather mild remedies, considering its generally bad-tempered tone of its indictment. But I mean, it's true there's not much in it about taxing the bastards out of existence, or you know, I finger the guilty men. But what I wanted to do rather was to identify places where the system had gone flabby and suggest ways in which, bit by bit, not overnight, this isn't a thing that you can do overnight, we could underpin its foundations and strengthen the ways it works, so that within about, and I think it will change, could change quicker than the skeptics think. I think that companies can be brought to change the ways they operate. I think councils can regain their powers and deploy them in sensible ways that we shall all feel the benefit of. And political parties, I don't think even they're beyond hope. I think that if you give people a genuine reason for joining a political party, that it gives you influence and power on policy and selecting candidates, then I think people will redo it. And if you want to parallel with the past, after the great crash of 1929, the ways in which companies operated all through the 30s, 40s, and 50s was completely different. Inequality was just as bad in the 1920s as it has become again today. In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and right up until our own time, CEOs and people running large public corporations were extremely modest in their demands because they recognized that they had a responsibility to society rather than simply an opportunity to take from society. But of course, there is a danger that the besetting sin of politicians, British politicians particularly since the war, is not following through their first impulses. Almost all prime ministers and cabinet ministers in our times, and here I would make, since this is in some sense a criticism of many of the things, or some of the things that Margaret Thatcher did, in this she was an exception, that she did always follow through. She had that tenacity of purpose, which is essential if you are to change the way things operate. I don't think this is a watershed moment like 1945 or 1979, because not all the streams fall down the same side of the hill. The task today is not to work for a smaller state or a larger state. It's to identify what needs to be done to put right the corrosions of capitalism and the accompanying erosion of democracy. It's a long-haul flight, and that's quite clear, and we've only just begun, but I hope at least that we are traveling together on it. Thanks very much indeed.
Do you see the kind of arguments you make as part of a movement within the British centre-right, or does the very idea of being part of a movement appall you?
Well, no, it didn't appall me. Yes, I think it is. I think, the trouble with politics in general and politicians is that they can only accommodate one thing at a time, one sense of direction, one driving purpose. And the driving purpose in the 80s and the 90s was to bring Britain back from total economic collapse and recreate some kind of economic dynamism and opportunity. I don't think it's a movement just on the centre-right. I think that Ed Miliband has made a couple of speeches saying things which Tony Blair
would never have said.
Would never have said.
No.
Would never have thought, possibly,
No.
but certainly wouldn't have said.
I fully accept, as someone who, for his sins, votes Labour, the Brown government, you had to get rid of Gordon Brown in 2010. Labour was just exhausted. It was over. But the problem was you had a Conservative and to some extent a Liberal Democrat Party coming in that was just wholly unable to cope with the new condition. Are you sure this government has got the ideas, the feelings to respond to the challenges of the time?
No, I'm certainly not sure, and I don't think anyone else is. I think they've got so much on their plates, so much more than they expected to find on their plates, that there's scarcely there's scarcely the sort of space to really embark on a kind of proper, full-blooded reform of any of these things. I think there is, to that extent, a new consensus that inequality is a problem, and that at the bottom you have to think about things to do, what you've got to do, and it's not easy because there is global competition does certainly level down wages at the bottom. But, there are ingenious new suggestions, such as the living wage, which Boris has taken over from Ken and adopted as a thing to conscript companies which can afford to pay rather more than the minimum wage into the scheme. And you get there by rather small steps, I think.
Can I take on your term oligarch, which is quite a historically loaded term? I mean, in what sense do you think Britain is an oligarchy, as distinct from a democracy?
Well, first of all, oligarchies can also be democracies of an imperfect sort. 16th century Venice, 18th century England had democratic institutions, but that is what centralization does produce. And what it produces is the revolving elites which were identified by all those 19th century and 20th century Italian sociologists, is that elites go round and round, and David Cameron's called it crony capitalism, but you have directors and CEOs of one FTSE company approving the pay of the CEOs of another FTSE company and vice versa.